First of all, I just wanted to sort of talk about my. I'm really chuffed that Ken's agreed to talk with us today. When I took a hiatus of playing video games for like several decades, and when in about 2011, 12, I came back to video games. BioShock was one of the first sort of console games that I played, and I was totally blown away by playing BioShock, and I hadn't really come across anything of that scale, of that kind of level of narrative immersion that was kind of soaked in kind of weird offbeat philosophy. Um, had a kind of steampunk vibe, and it was underwater and loads of crazy stuff going on in that game. And then in the middle of it, there's this kind of massive narrative reversal, which I've seen in a lot of video games since, but that was my first kind of experience of playing like a full-on AAA kind of game with a massive narrative reversal in the middle of it. So I really, really found that game to kind of shake my kind of understanding of storytelling really on a sort of video game level. So I'm really chuffed to have Ken here. Hello, Ken.
Hey there. Nice to be here.
Yeah, brilliant. So I've got a whole bunch of questions here that I'd like to sort of talk through with you, and really interested to know kind of what's going on with your current game and your processes, really. And then we'll have some Q&A from the audience in the last 15 minutes or so, I think. So yeah, brilliant. So, first of all, I wanted to ask you, I've not seen this anywhere else in my research, but what was the first video game that you either played or kind of got interested or obsessed with yourself?
Wow. I think probably the first video game I played was the first, video game essentially, which is like Pong. It wasn't the first video game. It was the first coin op game, but yeah, that was probably the first time I encountered a video game, back in the 70s. Because there really wasn't. There used to be these sort of electromechanical, like glorified pinball machine type games that you could play. If you want to see one in the movie Jaws, there's a one where they're shooting at a shark in the arcade, and that's like one of these old electromechanical where they're just using, lights turning on behind illustrations, and they're using very rudimentary techniques to track this sort of physical gun object you have. But then you had Pong, and then Space Invaders and Pac-Man, and of course I got my Atari 2600 back in the day. So I was really there I was a kid, but I was there at the very beginning as a gamer.
And was there a particular game where kind of story emerged that made you think a little bit different about the kind of format?
Yeah, I mean there was a game in the Atari 2600 which is really kind of an unsung hero called Adventure. And it was a very basic game where you were literally a square that you move around the screen, and there's like these dragons you fight who look like chickens. And it's a very basic series of sort of what a classic adventure game elements what you think of now. You have to find these keys to open these doors to these castles and avoid these dragons, and you can get a bridge that lets you move between walls, and you would pick up objects just by walking next to them and hitting the button, and then you were carrying them around. And that stuff was all really the first time any of that stuff had ever been done. And it's really kind of unknown now. We're going to be honoring it a bit in Judas, doing a bit of a shout out to it. Um, but that was the first game that sort of opened my eyes to the possibilities. But then there was in the early 90s, I played a game called Ultima Underworld, which I ended up getting my first job at that company eventually, a company called Looking Glass. And that was the game where I really realized the value of how you could take world storytelling, the visual storytelling that didn't need a lot of words, and how you could have events that would happen that were not designed by the designers to be together, but would merge together in these dynamic moments. You're having a combat here and you're running away, and then you run into another enemy, but the enemies from the first encounter are still chasing you. So the encounter becomes a sort of what we call emergent thing, something that happened that the game developers never specifically could have planned for in the way you could plan for it's like a choose your own adventure book where each page is a state, a bespoke state. And that's what really inspired me to think about how to make more games that really let the player dictate more of the action in the game.
Great. Um, so sort of circling back to you and your process, do you have a particular process for kind of coming up with ideas or writing, or does it is it not possible to define it because you're just kind of around it in a way?
The process is just sort of usually necessity. Like I'd be like, what problem do I have to solve today? Is it a new game? Okay, well, and then I sort of tell myself, okay, guess time to come up with the new game. And you go on a run, you're in the shower, or you're just talking to people on the team, and you set a goal, which is like, hey, what's our next problem? And then you just sort of try to clear the decks in your brain and get in that space. And so we do it, every most days we have a writer's room meeting on the game, and it's like, okay, well, what problem do we have to solve now? And sometimes it's what next quest we have to write, and sometimes it's like, oh man, these story elements don't make any sense. The users are like really confused. How do we solve the problem? And it's usually, figuring out the the best way to do something that's gonna require the least amount of like confusion from the player, and you just you have a debate essentially amongst each other, a debate, a conversation, and it's really my favorite part of the job because it's like puzzle solving. I get to go to work every day and get paid to solve really complicated puzzles that don't really have a clear answer because what's fun? It's not like you can mathematically determine it. So you're sort of using a lot of intuition, a lot of guesswork, and I think a lot of humility because you try to have a lot of, at least you try to have a lot of humility because you're often going to be wrong for a very long time on a game before you're right.
Interesting. Um, and do you have particular influences and inspirations that you bring in, or I guess, yeah, I'm just interested in what drives you and what drives your sense of kind of what is right for the game and the story and the world.
Um, my game influences are, from games, especially the games, I mentioned before, and I was fortunate enough to work at that company that made Ultima Underworld. So they've always been a huge influence, um, but but I'm also really influenced by games that are quite different than the kind of games I make. Like there's a game called XCOM, which is a turn-based strategy game with really no bespoke story of any kind. And that was a huge influence because it's all about um it's very much it was one of the first really mostly procedural games, but it allowed, because it was so reactive to player action, it really allowed a player experience like nobody else has ever had because each player is having such a different gameplay experience. It's the opposite of bespoke. Even games like Civilization, I always love because similarly, there's just like a lot of interesting elements that combine in tons of different ways. So I've really tried to spend a lot of my career figuring out how do I mix that emergence, which means, the player not knowing the state the player is going to be in with a very specific setting and world and a story. And so, my previous games have been much more linear, and Judas is really about how do I combine that sort of emergence proceduralism of something like an XCOM or Civilization with a real narrative, the stuff that people expect from us, real characters, real settings, real meaningful dramatic beats and character progression, but also on the player to have a massive impact on that space.
And is that an interesting area for you? I mean, do you see it as kind of the player performing within your world, or is it? I mean, because obviously gameplay and can be just kind of reacting to certain things, and you talked about that kind of emergent thing where two scenes kind of start to combine, and
Yep.
that becomes like. and unknown and emergent. And I'm interested in kind of how kind of performance and possibly elements of. If I read correctly, did you sort of start out in with some sort of interest in the theatre as a younger Ken?
Yeah. Yeah, I was my creative start, I didn't really know I was into a creative person when I was a kid. I consumed a lot of media. I played a ton of video games and board games, and I loved reading comic books back in the day. Um, and so I was really interested in creative fields, and I loved one of my big influences was a movie called Logan's Run from the 1970s because that was the first dystopia I ever saw. And like something about that movie I just became it wasn't a very good movie. It looks like you might have seen it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, several
but
times.
it's really got an imaginative concept and some really great stuff. And it was a year before Star Wars, so the special effects it became very dated very quickly because the next year Star Wars came out, and all of a sudden special effects had a revolution. For those too young to know, special effects in sci-fi movies in the 70s, outside of like Kubrick, were not really anything to write home about. And then, so a lot of these movies look pretty cheesy now, but that was a huge influence on me because I was like, oh, I remember hearing the trailer and it talked about in the future, all your dreams will become true, all your pleasures will be granted. It's this utopian vision, but there's just one catch: you die at 30. And I was like 10 at the time, and I was like, what? Wait, what? That sounded so cool. And then I eventually got into reading more sort of dystopic stories. I got introduced to Orwell and introduced to Huxley and Brave New World as a teenager. But I was working. I went to this arts camp called Bucks Rock, which is a really great place in Connecticut. But I wasn't an artist, so I went there because I think my sister went there, and you didn't have to. There's no schedule during the day, so you could just go to to the print shop or to do glass blowing or to do theater. And I ended up in theater tech, like doing sound design as a kid, sort of supporting the real adults who are probably doing most of the work. Um, and putting on these fairly elaborate shows. And then eventually there was like a talent show, and I was like, oh, what if I wrote a play for it? I never wrote a play before. And I sat down one afternoon and I wrote a play, and all of a sudden I woke up from this experience and I was like, whoa, where did I go? Um, and I did this one act play and we actually put it on. I was in it, and I was sort of off to the races, and I started, becoming a playwright, and eventually that led to screenwriting, which eventually led to the game stuff.
And then to sort of replay some of that kind of question. I mean, where do you see similarities or kind of echoes of that idea of performance, or even if it's with the player, or maybe it's the actors bringing those characters of yours to life? I don't know. I just think it's a really interesting because video games are so live and
Yep.
performative aspects of it. It's kind of not people don't dig into that so much. They talk about the writing and stuff, but I think it's a really interesting area that the idea of performing within that space is kind of cool, really.
You're definitely onto something in the sense that my theater experience is very relevant in games for a couple of reasons. One is, well, actually, theme parks like Disney World and theater are both places where where there's drama happening, but you don't control the audience's eye, right? Now, it's way more controlled than a video game in theater, but it's not like a movie where you can do a close up and you can really direct the action. You can change the lensing and the lighting. I can change the lighting in theater, but um, it taught me a lot about how do you draw attention when you don't control the audience's eye. So, and also if you go to Disney World, like if you want to be a game designer or any kind of game developer, go walk around Disney World and think about how they create the environments and how they transition between the environments, how they draw your eye. There's lots of elements. You can watch documentaries on this, like the castle in the center is always like a central point that everybody can identify. Landmarking. When you go between like Fantasyland and Frontierland. I'm not sure remember all the names, but you see how they transition, titrate from one type of space to another. It's not just a hard line where you cross over a line and you're suddenly here to there. It's so carefully thought through. And similarly to theater and similarly to games, you don't control everything. So I've always been a fan of trying to remove, games have these things called cutscenes where you're basically lock the player down and they watch a movie for a few minutes. I never really love making those because to me, the game is about giving the player freedom as much as you can. Um, and therefore, I had to learn a lot of techniques from theater about and from theme parks about how do you draw attention where because there's places you want the player to look at, but we don't want to grab their head and point them at them. This also comes into performance of the actors. I often tell the actors that it's more like theater than it is like film because I don't have your face I can't see every pore on your skin in the scene. And it's a shame in some ways because the actors are so great and we do video their performances for if we ever need reference for animation or whatever. But we know we're never going to have that, almost never going to have that control. So it is theater comes a lot into it. And so it's a really good observation, Christian.
And I mean, do you do you direct a lot of the actors yourself, or do you have people doing that,
Yeah.
or do you like that level of detail on your games?
Yeah, it's a mix. I direct mo the vast majority. I'm Judas. I've directed almost all of it until now. We're have a lot to get done before the end. So there's stuff you can work with other directors on, like AIVO, which is like, the lines the characters call on combat, because those are less emotionally complex. They're much more technical. You have to be loud, you have to be quick, and there's a lot of great directors. So we started working with a couple of really great directors. But yeah, pretty much I'm directing the bulk of it, and I'm also rewriting in the room with the actor, which is great because I'm also the lead writer. So I get to hear it coming out of their mouths. And I think one of the reason I've had an advantage and our games have done well from a dramatic standpoint is not just because, I'm such a genius or the team is, so much better than every other writing team or a lot of other writing, because we get to a lot of times game writing is not a priority in projects. And so like there's a writer and the writer never meets the director quite often. And quite often the script gets given to the actors and like I have actors I work with and they tell me often you just get a script, the director doesn't really know much about the project. And it's not because nobody doesn't care. It's just because like I'm the president of the company, so I can say writing is and narrative is a priority. And so I can give it the resources it needs to thrive.
Nice. Um, what do you have any thoughts or tips for people who might be watching on kind of creating a balance between linear narrative and systems thinking?
So I've this project is that challenge for us. It's how do we make a game that has this sort of narrative depth or even more narrative than our previous games and narrative clarity of like the characters being very specific. We're sort of known for our characters and our world setting, but also give the player the level of narrative freedom they've had in terms of like combat freedom they've had in previous games. We've always had a very good emergent combat space in our games. Like, we put a lot of tools in the player's hands and tools in the environment, and they can really manipulate the environment control. But the narrative was very linear, even though we had certain nods, like in BioShock, you could harvest or save the little sisters. But the deltas that actually created were fairly marginal in the game. Like you had different ending cutscenes, and you had like one scene, if you remember, where you sort of end up in the little sister lair. Um, and that would be very different depending on how you had treated the little sisters. But there's two states essentially. So we like wanted to take that idea and just like how much of that can we do? So even the central conflict in Judas, which is really about you're you're interacting with these three entities, these three characters, and each one of them wants you to help them get down to this planet because you're stuck on the ship and there's an asteroid field between you and the planet, and you can only choose one of them. So you're sort of competing, or they're competing for your attention, and that who becomes your friend and goes down the planet with you versus who becomes an antagonist is all dynamic in the game. And we had never written a story like that because it's not just like a linear thing, like, okay, you go down this road and you get locked in. dynamically, the player can go back and forth between them and betray one of them and then make it up to them later. And that's not a bespoke moment. These are all based on like them judging you based on what you did. And there's a under the hood, there's sort of a point system that's, adding up how much they like you or don't like you. But the content and that can spawn is really radically different. So the game can have the central story is fine about effectively this relationships and these contests for who you're going to go with, and is has a dynamic structure. Now underneath that there's a progression of the relationships. If you spend a lot of time with, say Tom, with this one character, and you get to the end with him, you're going to know all about him, and your relationship will form because the player has chosen that relationship. Compared to like our previous game, BioShock Infinite, you had a really intense relationship with this character called Elizabeth, your companion character, but that was not dynamic in any way, shape, or form. What you did in, there didn't change the game at all, or didn't change her opinion about you at all. So I really wanted to think about what are human relationship dynamics? Human relationship dynamics are kind of under the hood. There's a score system, right? You know, you don't bring out the garbage and you lose points with your wife, right? And or you say something funny and you gain some points, or you remember her birthday or whatever. And then when there's a fight, it's not just like, I don't like you. It's, Krishna, you didn't bring out the garbage and you forgot this and you didn't do that. And that's why I'm mad. And those things are arbitrary things based on what you did. So we want to make a game where if that relationship started to sour, it would sour for specific reasons that they could talk about and recognize what you've done. And this came out of in our last game where I got this idea at the middle of our last game, BioShock Infinite. And that game is you're just sort of going through this experience. Our innovation in that game was having this companion with you who was an AI, um, but we've poured a huge amount of work into making her feel like a friend. But I sometimes, well, wouldn't it be great if she could judge you at some point and based on your actions, and the game could change radically? But at that point, we're in the middle of the game. There's just no way. The game is structured as linear. But in this game, we wanted to make all that dynamism possible, where you could start somebody as a friend, they could alienate them and maybe come back, and the other people are competing and they're bribing you to help them. And if you don't take their bribes, they get mad. Or if you take a bribe and then you don't act on it, they get really mad, like you make a promise to them. Um, that is that required an entire rethinking of how we build these games. So everything sort of became, we call it narrative Lego. Everything became, we built all these bespoke pieces of content, whether it's art or characters or lines of dialogue. And the game is based on a bunch of very complex rules, is building a lot of the adventure in real time, pulling from these bespoke handcrafted elements. Like the game doesn't generate any dialogue at all. It strings together various pre-recorded pieces of dialogue that we had to very carefully structure. And I have a amazing partner and a guy named Drew Mitchell who is drives all of this underlying systemic stuff with Ben Zaks and his team. And the game is watching constantly for what you're doing and reacting on a very low level and building new levels for you effectively, the different experiences for you, different encounters, and very different dynamics as these relationships go through these dynamic arcs. And we had to rethink everything. Like, how do you write that kind of story? So I think we've really figured it out. I mean, the audience will tell us in the end, but it took us a very long time just to figure out, hey, how do you build that technology? And none of it is like, none of it is AI, like it's all rules, handcrafted rule set. Um, because it's not dynamic and it's not spawning dialogue at runtime. It's curating. We taught it to curate the content to build exciting experiences for the player that are highly reactive. And it was a lot of work, but I think I would never go back and do things the old way again.
It sounds like a massive amount of content and variables and different materials, like a nuance, like all, yeah. I mean, it just sounds like a lot of content and on different kind of levels of what you're going to need to call back into the game.
Yep.
That's just an observation. I
It's a
don't know
lot.
what the
It's a
question
lot, and
is.
the players will not see a ton of it in a playthrough. And that's the pain and the joy, right? But
Yeah,
that they won't see a ton of our content in one playthrough because they chose this one character, but even, and ended up not seeing the other characters' full storylines. And there's huge secrets they won't know if they don't do that. But the story's still coherent. But that's a choice we made. We knew this was going to be very different than our previous games. We knew everybody was going to see pretty much everything.
yeah. I mean, what maybe there's a few sessions today at the conference around different use of AI, and obviously, as you say, the material within Judas has no AI in it at all. But obviously, in BioShock Infinite, your companion was an AI, and that was like an interesting human machine relationship. I mean, do you have any thought? If you just don't want to talk about AI, I
No,
totally respect it. But it's an interesting kind of next step that the world is going through, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, for your own experience or for the kind of like humanity and where we're going.
yeah, I mean, I'll try to narrow it to my feelings about, how it affects my work because I don't think I'm wise enough to comment on a larger scale. I mean, the game actually, because you're dealing with these three characters are actually robots who didn't know they were robots. They were running the ship, and the main character reveals that they're robots because that was a secret, and that breaks the whole situation and sort of sends them each into sort of a kind of nervous breakdown when they realize their whole lives are lies. We deal with the themes of the deltas between humans and AIs, and it's funny because as we were making this game, large language models and those things the Transformer, Google created Transformer 2017. We started this game in 2014. So the world has really evolved. Our storyline involves a pandemic, and this is, then COVID happened in the middle of it. So all these, we're trying to sort of keep up a little bit, but our theories, I had talked to, we had an MIT guy who was one of our technology consultants because we had a lot of people we've talked to trying to get. It's not hard science fiction at the level of, say, The Martian or Hail Mary, which is sort of a mix of hard sci-fi, but he really tries to make it believable as he can. It's harder in a video game because there's just a level of fantastic. There's a level of the kind of scenes you can have and the expressive tools the player has are very different than, say, Matt Damon in The Martian has his expressive tools. But the main character is an engineer, so we really wanted to get um, the science right as much as we could. So I had a lot of early conversations about large language models and understanding what they were, sort of before they were more mainstream. And it was just fascinating to me because, they're essentially a type of predictive machine. That's really what they do, right? They look at the next word and then tries to see what's the most likely word or the most likely next pixel, right? It's all it's doing. It's not a larger thinking thing. It is really just mostly a predictive thing. And I'm not super impressed. Um, and yeah, there's also a distinction. Elizabeth in BioShock Infinite was obviously a traditional video game AI, not built on any kind of large language model. But we have been using it a lot, not for generative purposes. I don't think it's particularly compelling there because the truth is, if you have, Google tool X and I have Google tool X, and we're giving it the same prompt, we're gonna get the same, well, not exactly because they're non-deterministic. We're gonna get how am I going to compete with you and how are you going to compete with me, right? If we're just typing in the same prompt. The human element is absolutely critical because the software is the software. And if everybody can just press an easy button and make the thing, you're not going to have a competitive advantage. Um, the other thing is that it, there's a thing which it's got a bunch of problems. And if I go too deep into this, you can just tell me to shut up and we can move on to another topic. But I think about it a lot just because of what's going on, but because it's so central in the game as a theme. Um, you, we know it's read all of Shakespeare's works, and it knows it intimately can sort of ape that, but it doesn't know what made him write the line, you know, the devil have power to assume a pleasing shape or something like that. We don't know where that came from. We don't know, right? Um, we don't know what makes human creation. And it could turn out it's a very deterministic thing, like a machine, because we may just be sorting next word based on whatever our body chemistry happens to make that process happen. We could just be fancy, large language models, sort of. Um, but right now, we know we have a huge advantage, which is we can translate our interiority. An artist can transfer their interiority to something, and the AI is trained on all the exteriority of the artist, right? The work they produced, but they don't understand the interiority. So that's a bit of a philosophical thing. I also think that, and I'm working directly with a lot of these big companies. They AI is both the most, like I think your previous guest was talking about. You tend to have people who are either totally for it or totally against it, and that's not necessarily the people to that's not really where the truth is. The truth is it's got some huge benefits, utility, and some real limitations right now. Hallucinations are one of them. But where we're excited about it is we're using it to, for instance, we've had it read our entire game script. So when it's 10 o'clock at night and I am starting on a plot line that I haven't touched in 2 months because I've been doing other things, I don't have to go back and read the 50 pages of script I wrote. I can just say to the AI, can you summarize this script, these previous scripts I wrote and the team wrote? We're training it on helping us with our bug database. So for instance, when you find a bug, sometimes you get a log file attached of um like hundreds of pages of text that the computer has spewed out. You could have the AI try to intelligently read that and find out what caused the bug. Because big problem in games is um, what broke this, right? When something's broken, it's not always immediately apparent. In fact, it's quite often not apparent. You'd be very surprised often in what actually is causing the problem. So finding the root cause is a term, root cause analysis. We're struggling to get it to suck in that much data, but that's the kind of tool it's really useful for. Also for analytics, we're tracking all the things the players do, so we can see like, okay, if a player said they got bored, we can do analysis on what was happening. Like, were they out of ammo? Had a narrative event not fired, and they were just bored because nothing was happening. So we have this huge analytic database, but to access that, you need some genius guy who knows how to manipulate this tool. So we're trying to get that data set to be queryable through an open cursor, query like a chat GPT like query. We're working with Gemini, with Google, but and that there's a lot of challenges in that. So I think people are saying that
Yeah.
all jobs are going to be replaced in 9 months are completely full of it. It's just ridiculous. It's not even like in that universe. It's got a lot of problems, but it's also got a lot of potential. But I think to me, that potential is really in helping us manage our data and our communications between each other, because those are the biggest problems on a huge project. You've got so many people. uh, how can you catch up on what's going on? So we've trained it on our design documents. So a new designer getting onboarded can learn about all the design without having to sit there and somebody having to retake somebody through that. And then they're working in the middle of the night. They can query the design documents like, what's the purpose of this thing I saw in the game? And the database can tell us that, but it's all just studying our data that we create. And I think it's really useful there. I'm much more skeptical on the Gen side.
Yeah, interesting. Really interesting to get your take on it and hear how how useful and not useful it might be in those sort of scenarios. So that's brilliant. Thank you. Talking more sort of generally about your work and the games that you've made, are there any examples of details that kind of helped you change direction or move the dial for people who are kind of involved in making their own interactive stories and games? Is there anything that comes to mind on that? And it's just kind of details that kind of change direction.
Um, well, I mean, the first thing I'll say, just as broad advice for people who want to like get into game writing or any part of games, is just make yourself read as much as you can, watch as much as you can. Most of my inspirations, narrative inspirations, are not really from the game space. They're much more from um, books and TV shows and movies because I think they can just focus on the narrative so much. So I'm like, so like BioShock was heavily influenced by movies like The Manchurian Candidate, and Fight Club was another inspiration in terms of like the unreliable narrator concepts. Um, and and like there was some, P.T. Anderson and a lot of, in the tonality of like BioShock Infinite. Um, and like There Will Be Blood was a huge inspiration, and the Coen Brothers, Miller's Crossing was a lot of big inspiration for some of the dialogue styles in BioShock. Um, but um, in terms of, hmm, I mean, I think everybody's process is different. It's hard to give very generalized advice because my brain works differently than others. I take a really analytical approach to writing, and it wasn't how I started. I started just sort of sitting down, and when I was young, I would just be like, let's start on page one. And now, because of this, because games are written non-linearly, they're recorded non-linear. Like we don't start at the beginning and go to the end. And movies usually don't do that. Sometimes they can, but movies don't either. Really, right? They're often shot out of order. We are so out of order. It's not even so. Keeping your brain, understanding where you are in the dramatic flow when you're in this chaotic session and you're working with not you're in a your brain's in a chaotic space. You're working with an actor who is probably doing, like, we work with great actors like Troy Baker and Stephanie Kurbis and Nolan North, who are doing a million things. So you got to get their head in the space of this incredibly complex storyline that's full of variability. And so you got to be the anchor for them of understanding where are at in the story. Also, they're often acting with not the other actor in the room too, right? So we've been trying to do as much of that as possible, actually bring the actors together. In fact, we just did a scene, even though we're not doing performance capture, where we brought Stephanie and Troy like literally in the same room because the scene was so important. And we had to mic that really differently than we normally do. But I've always tried to get the actors interacting as much as possible. But you have to be you're always a salesman. You have to, if you want to get your ideas in something, if you want to communicate an idea to an audience, that's our job as an artist. It's really a kind of sales job. You're selling an idea to people. And as a creative, you need to figure out, you need to understand your audience. So say you're in your meeting and you're just pitching to your colleagues. That story can't just be the thing in your head. Where does the rubber meet the road with other people? And always be thinking of that. So we often have situations at the office where somebody will show me something and they'll start explaining what I'm seeing. And I'm like, no, no, don't explain it, right? I'm the audience. And you can brief me like what's not there because a lot of times it's work in progress, but never tell me, like this happens a lot where somebody will show you a new interface element. They're like, oh, what this means is like, no, don't tell me. Like I'm the audience. And so beating yourself into that state where you understand the range of time and information, that things that appear clear in your head to making it clear to the audience, especially when you're doing like fairly complicated storylines like we tend to do. Um, there are rules like too much information is too little information. The player, I think there's a term I use called player RAM, which is how much stuff can the player keep in their head at one time? And different games are different. So if you're playing like a Telltale game where there's no sort of skill challenge, no controller skill challenge, player has a lot more RAM to understand story, right? But if you're playing a first person shooter like we make, we the player can get really overwhelmed. So you can throw so much at them that they're not taking any of it in. So too much information could be too little information. And figuring out what is the right amount, what is the player RAM here is mostly guesswork, but an experience. But you'd be surprised how easy it is to overwhelm an audience because, half of your brain is trying to move around the world. Navigating 3D geometry is not a trivial skill, right? It takes a fair amount of probably, processing cycles in your head. So you've got to work in the space beyond that. And that's why we tend to use visual storytelling so much because the rate of data you get from a visual versus listening to somebody, this is like and visual data is like, so we try to lean on a visual as much as we can because there's a much higher rate of data transfer. And it also tends to draw on different parts of the brain. So you can sort of take in data, visual data and audio data at the same time. So you can duplex that effect, but your visual intake rate is much higher. So really thinking about how brains work. I don't mean like taking a class in neuropsychology, just like observing gamers and asking questions. What did you take away from this? And never lead the witness if you can avoid it, right? Show people to things, but you've got to be selling at all times. You got to be selling to your team. And that doesn't mean you got to be bullshitting. You got to figure out how do I make the rubber meet the road so this idea in my head, which seems so clear, becomes clear to other people. And you have multiple steps along the way from the team to QA to close betas before it goes out to the audience. And then it's kind of too late if you haven't figured it out.
Cool. Do you a bit of a random question. Do you kind of have ideas that you have about the games that are to do with marketing to the audience as well? Does that kind of like part of the concept that is kind of formed with your process, your creative process?
We've never sort of worked with, I've always worked with great marketers. I've hired a bunch of great marketers who are mostly focused on um, the very complicated data analysis work and setting up an event and dealing with the press. It just takes a lot of work and a lot of management, but we've been really collaborative in terms of we on the creative side tend to drive the creative of marketing because we understand the game. And I also know that everything is marketing. Like I said before, everything is sales. You are when you're pitching to the team. So I understand the message I want to get across. And then you take a bunch of guesses. Like we just, a couple of years ago, we finished the key art for the game, the visual key art, which is the thing you'll see on the Steam page or whatever on the box if there are still game boxes. But we're not. There's not really. And that was a bunch of guesswork, right? Like what is going to communicate the message of this game? But I was heavily involved in that, and in terms of the creative side, I have an amazing support team who like does the hard work, which is like finding the firm and the agency and all that other stuff. Or we actually just used actually internal concept artists that we already have in the product to do it. We didn't work with an agency. We tried, and the problem with agencies is it's just they're just not as immersed in the lore and everything. So we made I think a really lovely piece of key art, but we made it and then we test it because that's something you can test relatively easily. So we do things like we brought in a focus group and you show them the final key art, so various versions of final key art, right? So you can do that. And then you kind of like put it on a Steam page, like you mock up a Steam page, and you don't tell them what our game is. And you ask them to rank which things leaped out at them, right? Without leading, you want to do sort of a blind experiment here. It's not a double blind, but you can do a blind experiment where you don't tell them anything. You try not to lead the witness, and you see, because that's really important. Like if people don't notice your thing on the Steam page, that's the first thing. It doesn't get noticed, right? And the second thing is, what do they take away from it? So we ask those kind of questions, like, what do you think this game is? And does that excite you? Does do this? And we take that information. That's much easier on the marketing front. The creative front, it's because it's such a bigger thing. You're having many more challenges. But I never rely upon the user to tell me what type of game to make. I never rely on if they don't like something, I generally don't. It's very rare they'll say what to do to fix it, and you really shouldn't rely upon the audience for it. I think lots of other big companies can over focus test things, and they say, would you like to play a game set on a spaceship with a bunch of robots? And the audience, there's not enough information to get a meaningful answer because they're not. That's not how they meet the product. They meet the product through the marketing and the PR and the trailers and all that. And that's really what you have to show them. And that stuff's not there at the beginning. Um, so, but I do think that we really try to get things in front of the audience so we can see if there's consistencies in the things they like or don't like. And if they don't like it, then it's not just like, okay, we'll do what they said. It's like, why don't they like it? And like a bug, finding the root cause of why they don't like it, often requires a lot of guesswork. I think we're pretty good at that. And we've been testing the game. And every time we encounter a big negative in the testing, like, okay, what are we gonna do about this? And we sort of retested, we make our changes, and we've been pretty good at figuring out what they didn't like so far because we then do the next test. But I really believe in that testing process, but it can also become, it has to be a tool. It can't be the boss.
Yeah. Great. Well, we've got some questions from the audience as well. So I need to translate this a little bit, I think. It's been a while since your last game, and you have created some of the most memorable NPCs in games, all of which brilliantly written. Has the past 10 years or so and the way the world is changed and affected your approach to storytelling and character development?
I don't think the world. So yeah, I mean, the idea, I want to do two things with this game. One is I wanted to do all the dynamic stuff I was talking about before, but I wanted to write the characters a little more close to, our games obviously have a lot of visual exaggeration and it's larger than life. And even our art style tends to be not really entirely realistic. It tends to be a bit exaggerated. But, and we had, I think, some really great characters. But like, I don't know a Booker and Elizabeth, right? Booker's way more heroic than anybody else I know. I mean, he's also kind of very dark, and Elizabeth is, a bit idealized in her own way, right? I really wanted to make a game about, and Jack is in BioShock is Jack. He is sort of I mean, I don't want to spoil anything, but he's doesn't really have a big personality by design, right? Um, and I really want to make a game that we could get that was really about a relationship on the level of a Booker and Elizabeth, but fully dynamic across multiple characters that could go good ways or bad ways, but also um, writing about things that are much more grounded, like the problems they have, like, these robots. I was really inspired by that scene in Blade Runner, where it's kind of a really dark scene where Deckard tells Rachel the story about the spiders that she saw when she was a kid, and it's just clear proof that she's a replicant. And that moment of her life being shattered, they didn't really do much with the movie. In fact, it's very weird. They end up falling in love, even though it's such a cruel thing he does in the way he does it. Um, but that moment of having your understanding your life is have these machines, these robots who thought they were human and were very invested in their human lives and realized that every memory they had, or not every memory, but a lot of their memories are implants, and they had all these human feelings. And in fact, one of them, Hope, is so broken up by this, she becomes suicidal because she doesn't think her life, she has an existential crisis that her life has any meaning or purpose because she was the ship's therapist and thought she was so tuned into humans and her intuition about people, but it's all she realizes she's got sensors that can sniff pheromones and can sniff hormonal shifts and sweat glands and things like that. And she can detect changes in heart rate. And she thought that was her intuition. And each of the big three of these characters is their lives are shattered or reimagined. One of them realizes she loves that she's a robot because now all the things, her human imperfections, she can fix. She can fix them as bugs, right? Her fear, her this, her that. And so I really want to ground, it's a huge, literally an existential story about the end of the human species, potentially, because those are the stakes, because they are on a colony ship from fleeing an Earth that they thought was ravaged by a existential plague. But I wanted the feelings to be incredibly grounded in in real people as much as I could. And then doing that dynamically. So it took a different style of work with the writing, a different style of work with the acting. I had some training in sort of um, I was in a theater school once, and I had some training in sort of method acting, and trying to do sort of a lot of method writing to really get in touch more with like not filtering it through any kind of artifice. And even though the game is highly stylized and all this, it's much more grounded in terms of the people and the characters.
Interesting. Fantastic. Okay, so I have another one going back to System Shock. Was System Shock was one of yours? So it's a slightly complicated question. in the older game System Shock, there is some interpretable space by not directly seeing the events, faces of characters who leave the audio recordings. Just seeing certain traces, the game could be described as more open text than more modern games, which is filled in within, shown. Is there an argument to conceptually go back to that kind of more open, interpretable space in games as we go forwards? It's kind of interesting conceptual question.
Yeah, well, just to be clear, I did System Shock too. System Shock 1 was one of those games that massively inspired me. In fact, I think we're going to get a chance to work with the writer, bringing him in on this game of System Shock 1 because he was hugely
Cool.
inspirational. And a guy named Austin Grossman came up with the audio log concept. And what was great about that concept for people who don't know is he innovated where you find these sort of messages from people on the ship. And what I loved about what Austin did is they were so honest and raw. It was very naturalistic, and it was all just recorded with in-house like looking glass people. So it wasn't necessarily, the best actors of all time, but they were very real, and it felt like real people having their lives affected by this like massive AI. He was trying to destroy humanity, but it felt very grounded. So I think we sort of keep expanding on the tool set, right? Back then, the audio logs were a really great way to get people talking to you in the game. Now we're able to have these characters in our game appear wherever we need them to appear and start talking to you, bringing various um, lines together and mixing and matching them together to make larger thoughts. And they animate properly. So we've basically taken that concept of just having this direct human um, speech where you don't have to stop the game and watch a cutscene. That was another great thing about the audio logs. You can listen to them at your own pace. So I think that we've just been sort of expanding on that tool set over time, adding obviously back then the visuals were really limited, so we couldn't do that much visual storytelling. We tried, but we just keep getting more tools in the toolbox. But I'm really sort of building on that same desire, which is how do you tell a story to people when you don't where you're, where you don't force them to sit in a chair and watch it. And that's by the way, I love all kinds of games, and I think there's t tons of space for that. I don't think there's a right way to make games, but sort of my personal thing is I want to get as close as I can to the player, not always being interactive and always be able to choose and not be stuck. And because if I wanted to write sort of big cutscenes, that's really from that to me is what movies do really well. Games do allow the player to be participatory. But to be clear, I'm for all kinds of games. I'm never going to dictate what types of games people would make, but that's my personal goal is to get out of the way of get me out of the place and get the player in the world interacting with the characters dynamically as much as possible.
Cool. Um, this question is actually mine. Are there, and maybe it's talking about your competitors potentially. I mean, what other video games, contemporary games stand up as art for you, if any?
Uh, yeah, I sort of would question the question in a way because art, art to me, I've heard this conversation a long time. Art games art. It's a bit of a trap, right? What that really means is some critic with a small c, right? Not necessarily a games. Are you going to fit their perception of what art should be? To me, art is anything that has a function that is non-utilitarian. Um, that you changes your mood or emotion. Um, not is it high art? I think, you know, bullet hell games or boomer shooters can be art, right? Because I go somewhere, and that's what I value about games or art is it gives me an escape and a way to look at life in a different way. It's sort of like a kind of telepathy. You get to sort of live in somebody's head for a while, the creator's head. And all art is a intersection of that piece that they created and my experience of it. So I'm not a, I don't believe in authorial intent because one day I'll be dead and who cares what I think. There's going to be if you play my game, like Krishna, if you played BioShock, you had a one unique experience that maybe, and I've read interpretations of what I thought, and quite often they're way off Um, but in the end of the day, if that's your experience of playing the game, that's valid. So, wait, what was the original question? I may have gone past.
I
Oh,
think you
art.
took umbrage with my concept of whether the games were art, but I'm interested in what games turn you on, what you
Yep.
like, contemporary games.
So I think, even though I was sort of talking a lot about cutscenes, so you have a guy like Neil Druckmann who's just such an exceptional writer that, I'd watch his scene work anywhere, because he just understands story and character really, really well. And he's, couldn't write traditional stuff. That's why he did well on TV, I think, too. The guy who wrote Last of Us. Um, one of my favorite stories in a video game is a game called Inside, which literally has no words. It's a side scroller and it is all visual and it's this dystopic story. And there's so much you don't understand, but you understand enough to keep going. And there's not a single word in the whole thing. It's all visual storytelling. And the only thing you really do is the entire game is going from left to right. And you progress the story by moving right. And I would definitely recommend checking that game out. It's by, I think, a Danish company. It's some Scandinavian company called Playdead. Um, I tend to play games for the stories. It's weird. I'm not a huge story gamer. I like games that are really leaning to the gameplay. And I think part of it is because I don't like waiting. I like to play. I want to be active because I think that's how I get out of my own head, stress space. I want to be immersed. And if I'm gonna, so I'm not I think there's some really great stuff like Dishonored had some really great stuff and also great visual storytelling. That world was told me so much story. Half-Life and it's actually the same guy. He passed away, unfortunately, who was this sort of visual visionary on those two games, Half-Life 2 and Dishonored. Um, so I think there's a lot of great visual storytelling in games, but I tend not to play games for the super detailed storytelling. I play it for like the Gestalt experience, though I often appreciate like Baldur's Gate 3 had some amazing writing in it. There's a lot of games with really solid writing, um, but it tends not to be what I play games for.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think there's a lot of kind of interactive games where you feel like you might be playing an interactive story or an interactive film, but I think games are most powerful when you feel like actually you as the player are the story, not that you're playing a story, but that you are the story
Yeah.
and the story is happening to you because of you and that's where it's kind of going. And yeah,
And
I
you, and,
think there's
and
a
you
lot
and you
of
and uniquely to you. Like that's the thing about gameplay, and that's what we're trying to do with our story, is how can we make that story or experience, not just the gameplay experience, unique to you.
yeah. Interesting. I've got one last question from somebody in the audience. How do you write your non-linear scripts? Is there a specific type of document, system, or software you use?
Uh, oh boy. How do you write it? You have a really brilliant guy like Drew Mitchell who remembers every single thing in the script, like every line, as well as writing a lot of them. It is incredibly complicated. It's been an incredibly incremental process of making mistakes, like figuring out how to tell a dynamic story like this because we really wanted the main storyline to be dynamic, and took us so much work to figure out how to actually do that while still delivering the kind of storytelling that people expect out of our games. So, in terms of the technical stuff, honestly, we work in Microsoft Word, which is not a great sort of script writing tool. I'd much rather use like Final Draft or something like that, but it has to get exported in all these fancy, complicated ways to another piece of software whose name is escaping me, which so it can get into the file structure in Unreal to play the lines. And all those lines have to be managed because they're often, when they're played at runtime, they're often mixed together with different lines. And so we've written, I guess I always go back to the old saw, writing is rewriting. Like, and that's not how to learn. I rewrite, we rewrite, and eventually you have to stop, pencils down, but you need to not be afraid of killing your babies and you need to understand that writing. I remember when I wrote my first screenplay, like, oh, I did it 120 pages, and I had one draft, right? And now it's like it's like 10, I'll go back to a script 10 times if I have to. And hopefully you get as much as you can before the recording session, but often in the recording session, I'm still rewriting because if I write a line and it comes out of the actor's mouth and I have a great actor and they're just really struggling to say it, it's not the right line, right? You got to be flexible. And if you sit there and you start doing line readings, no, Troy, say it like this, you've really lost the value of the actor. Um, so you have to work with them, and some of them are quite collaborative. Some of them really just want to be told the line. Some of them engage on those conversations, and I love that. So you gotta have a lot of humility and understand you're going to make a lot of mistakes and be open to being wrong.
Brilliant. Well, our time is up. I've got to say, biggest thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I know that people in the audience have as well. Thank you so much for your, truth and honesty and openness, and best of luck with the game. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to say about Judas to leave us with, but I'm can't wait. I'm really keen, but I don't want to even ask you when it's due to be out because I know that these are
Yeah, I
lengthy.
can tell, I can tell we're working on it really hard. But yeah, I mean, if people are curious, there's a couple of you just, on YouTube, there's a couple of trailers out there and some interviews. I just did one with IGN. Um, it's a really interesting experiment. Hopefully, it will turn into a really great game. For the audience will think so, but it is really, it has been my dream to just keep empowering the player in the narrative as much as possible. And I think it's going to get there. We're really excited about it.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to our next session. Thank you, Ken. Yeah, really, really appreciate it.